At the airport, my daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You fly economy. We fly business class." It was not the seat that broke me. It was the way she said it. Calm, controlled, almost embarrassed by my presence. In that moment, I realized I was no longer her mother. I was an inconvenience. What she did not know was that I had paid for every ticket. What I did not know yet was how deep the betrayal truly ran. That single sentence cracked something open inside me, and once it split, there was no going back. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We are always amazed by how these stories connect people across different places and generations. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so do not hold back. And if you are new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you will always be the first to catch our latest stories of resilience, betrayal, and strength. Now, sit back, take a deep breath, and let's dive in. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 71 years old, a widow, and I live alone in a quiet neighborhood in Eugene, Oregon, where the mornings arrive softly and no one is in a hurry to be anywhere else. If you passed my house on an ordinary day, you would probably think nothing remarkable lived inside it. A small wooden place, weathered but cared for, with a maple tree out front and a porch that creaks in familiar places. That ordinariness once felt like a kind of victory to me. It meant stability. It meant peace. For more than 30 years, my late husband and I ran a small family furniture business together. We built it slowly, piece by piece, learning as we went, making mistakes, fixing them, and learning again. When he died, I sold the business because I could not imagine running it without him. The sale left me financially comfortable, not wealthy in a flashy way, but secure. I learned long ago that security mattered more than appearances. I still do my own grocery shopping, clip digital coupons, and drive a car old enough to confuse parking attendants. I never felt deprived. I felt grounded. After my husband passed, family became my anchor. More specifically, my daughter Melissa became the center of my emotional world. She is my only child, and for most of her life, she was the person I oriented myself around. Melissa lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, with her husband Andrew and their 2 children. From the outside, their life looks impressive. Large house, manicured yard, private schools, weekend brunches, and photos that suggest everything is going according to plan. I used to feel proud seeing those pictures. I still did, even when a quiet unease began creeping in. Melissa called me often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes because she was overwhelmed. She spoke about the pressure of keeping up appearances, about how expensive everything was, about how Andrew's work demanded constant networking and image polishing. I listened. I always listened. That had been my role since she was a child. When she sounded tired, I tried to be reassuring. When she sounded worried, I tried to be practical. When she needed help, I helped. At first, the financial assistance was modest. A short-term bridge until a bonus arrived. Help with a school deposit. Something unexpected that could not wait. I never kept records. I never asked for contracts or confirmations. I did not think of it as lending money. I thought of it as being a mother. Each time I said yes, it felt like I was preserving connection, maintaining relevance, staying needed in a life that no longer had room for me in everyday ways. Over time, I noticed that our conversations shifted. The calls became more purposeful, more scheduled. The warm check-ins faded, replaced by carefully framed explanations of urgency. I would hang up and realize that she had not asked how I was feeling or how my day had gone. When that thought surfaced, I brushed it aside. I told myself she was busy. I told myself I was imagining things. Mothers are good at forgiving in advance. In Eugene, my days were simple. Morning coffee by the window, a walk around the block if the weather allowed, volunteer work at the library once a week. I had friends, acquaintances, routines. Yet whenever my phone rang and I saw Melissa's name, something in me still straightened, alert and ready. I did not yet understand that I was preparing myself not for conversation, but for obligation. At that time, I truly believed my generosity was strengthening our bond. I believed that love, expressed through reliability and sacrifice, would naturally be returned in respect. I had no reason, I thought, to doubt my own daughter. After all, mothers do not imagine betrayal where there has only ever been family. And I was still convinced that whatever I gave freely, and that freedom made it safe. If you are still watching and already sensing that something feels slightly off beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now, let's move into the moment that quietly changes everything. Not long after I settled back into the rhythms of my quiet life, Melissa called with an idea that sounded, at first, like a gift. She suggested that I join her family for a short vacation in Napa Valley, California, a place I had only ever seen in magazines and travel brochures. She framed it as time together, a chance for the children to be with their grandmother. I paused from everyone's busy schedules. I remember feeling a small, warm lift in my chest when she asked. Invitations had become rare over the years, and this one felt like proof that I still belonged in her world. She sounded efficient, almost brisk, as she spoke. The trip was already planned, the dates fixed. She said she would send me the flight information so I could book my ticket. There was no discussion about whether those dates worked for me, no curiosity about my preferences, but I barely noticed at the time. I told myself that families sometimes move quickly, that flexibility was a small price to pay for togetherness. When the message arrived with the flight details, I opened it casually, expecting nothing more than confirmation. Instead, the numbers on the screen gave me pause. The airfare was unusually high for such a short trip, especially booked so close to departure. I stared at the price longer than I normally would have, my practical instincts quietly surfacing. In the past, I would have suggested adjusting dates or waiting for a better fare. This time, I hesitated only briefly. I reminded myself that I was not struggling. I had savings. I could afford the ticket. More importantly, I told myself that asking questions might complicate things. I did not want to seem difficult or ungrateful. Somewhere along the line, I had learned that smoothness often mattered more than clarity, especially when it came to my relationship with my daughter. So I clicked purchase and closed the page, trying to ignore the faint unease that lingered after. In the days that followed, preparations happened without me. Melissa did not ask whether I had booked my seat or what time I would arrive. She did not mention coordinating airport pickups or meeting points. I assumed everything would sort itself out. I always had. Still, a subtle shift had taken place. For the first time, I felt less like a participant and more like someone being folded into plans already complete. As the trip drew closer, I noticed how differently our lives now moved. My days in Eugene unfolded slowly and predictably. I walked the same streets, greeted the same neighbors, lived in a pace that allowed for thought. Melissa's life, by contrast, seemed driven by schedules, appearances, and constant motion. Napa Valley felt emblematic of that difference. It was a place chosen for impression as much as enjoyment, and I wondered, fleetingly, whether I would fit into it at all. The night before my flight, I packed carefully, folding clothes I had worn many times before, and choosing comfort over style without thinking twice. I told myself that being present mattered more than looking the part, yet as I zipped my suitcase, I felt an unfamiliar weight settle in. I could not name it exactly. It was not fear, and it was not regret. It was the sense that I was stepping into a space where the rules were different, where my instincts might no longer serve me as well as they once had. On the morning of departure, I moved through my routine with practiced calm. Coffee, a final look around the house, a quiet moment on the porch. I told myself that this was just another trip, another chapter of being a mother who showed up when asked. Still, beneath that reassurance, a quieter thought pressed forward. This journey felt less like a return to family and more like an entry into something undefined. As I locked the door behind me, I realized that I was carrying more than a suitcase. I was carrying expectations, assumptions, and a belief that love alone could smooth over any imbalance. I did not yet know how fragile that belief had become, or how quickly it would be tested. But even then, as I headed toward the airport, I sensed that this trip would mark a shift, whether I was ready to acknowledge it or not. If you are starting to feel that the tension is building and something bigger is coming, comment number 2 below so I know you are paying attention. Now, let's step into the airport, where everything begins to crack. Portland International Airport was already crowded when I arrived that morning, the kind of controlled chaos that makes everyone move faster than they feel ready to. I had arrived early, as I always did, rolling my small suitcase behind me and scanning faces with the quiet anticipation that comes with meeting family after time apart. For a moment, I imagined spotting Melissa waving, the children running toward me. Instead, I saw them standing near the priority check-in area, composed and self-contained, as though they belonged to the airport rather than passing through it. Melissa looked polished, in a way that made me suddenly aware of my own simplicity. Her coat was tailored, her hair smooth and intentional. Andrew stood beside her, focused on his phone, while the children hovered close, already absorbed in their own small screens. I felt a flicker of self-consciousness, an instinctive urge to straighten my posture, to look as though I fit neatly into the picture they presented. When Melissa noticed me, her smile appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. She stepped toward me, then stopped, glancing around as if calculating something. Instead of embracing me, she gestured subtly for me to follow her a few steps away from the others. That movement alone told me this was not a greeting. It was a separation. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and precise, stripped of warmth. She explained that there had been a seating issue. Andrew's client, someone important to his business, was traveling on the same flight. It would be better, she said, if we did not sit together. I would be in economy. They would be in business class. The words were delivered cleanly, efficiently, as if they were logistical details rather than something capable of wounding. I did not respond right away. The noise of the terminal seemed to dull around us, as though my mind had narrowed its focus to that single sentence. It was not the seat itself that hurt. I had flown economy my entire life without complaint. What unsettled me was the ease with which she placed distance between us, as though my presence might reflect poorly on the image she needed to maintain. I searched her face for hesitation, for an apology, for any sign that she understood what she was asking of me. There was none. She looked relieved, as though she had finally said something she had rehearsed. Behind her, Andrew glanced up briefly, then returned his attention to his phone, already disengaged. I nodded. The gesture surprised even me. It was automatic, the reflex of someone who had learned long ago that compliance avoided discomfort. I told her it was fine, that I understood. The words tasted thin as I spoke them, but they served their purpose. Melissa smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her mouth, and turned back toward her family without another word. I stood where she left me, watching as they moved together toward the priority lane. The children followed her easily, unquestioning, while I remained rooted in place, suddenly unsure of where I belonged. No one around us seemed to notice. To the rest of the terminal, nothing unusual had occurred. A family had simply separated to board in different sections. As I walked toward the economy gate, the physical distance mirrored something internal that had quietly shifted. I felt exposed, as though a private truth had been spoken aloud in a public space. I was not an equal participant in this trip. I was an accessory, included conditionally, managed carefully. I found a seat near the window and set my suitcase at my feet. My hands rested in my lap, still, while my thoughts moved restlessly. I told myself not to overreact. I reminded myself that appearances mattered in Andrew's line of work, that Melissa was only trying to protect her family's interests. Yet even as I offered these explanations, another thought pressed forward, unwelcome but persistent. If my presence was inconvenient here, where else had I already been quietly pushed aside? Without fully deciding to do so, I reached for my phone. The screen lit up, familiar and neutral, and I opened my banking application. I did not scroll yet. I simply looked at the numbers, at the account that had always represented safety and control. For the first time, a question formed clearly in my mind, steady and unsettling. When had helping become something expected, and when had I stopped being more than that? If that airport moment hit you the way it hit me, comment number 3 below and stay with me. What happened next was not just emotional, it was revealing. Once I was settled into my seat in the economy cabin, the world seemed to shrink to a narrow row of strangers and the persistent hum of the engines. The air felt closer here, heavier somehow, and I became acutely aware of how little space I occupied. I told myself it did not matter. I had chosen this seat many times before. Still, the contrast lingered in my mind, sharpened by what had just happened at the gate. I opened my phone again, more deliberately this time. The banking application loaded slowly, as if giving me a chance to change my mind. My intention was simple. I wanted reassurance. I wanted to confirm that everything was as I remembered it, that the quiet unease stirring inside me was nothing more than a reaction to embarrassment. I scrolled through recent transactions, expecting familiarity. Instead, the number startled me. Transfers to Melissa's account appeared again and again, closer together than I had realized. The amounts were larger than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply stopped adding them up. My chest tightened as I traced the dates, noticing how often they followed our conversations. I felt my pulse quicken, not from panic exactly, but from a creeping sense that I was standing on uncertain ground. My first instinct was to explain it away. Of course, there were many transfers, I told myself. Families help each other. Life was expensive where Melissa lived. Children had needs. Andrew's work was unpredictable. Each explanation felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a familiar pattern of justification that I had used for years without question. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I continued scrolling. The pattern became harder to ignore. Requests, transfers, promises to settle things later. I searched for repayments, even partial ones, and found none. I paused, then searched again, convinced I must have missed something. The absence was unmistakable. A quiet clarity settled over me, uncomfortable and undeniable. I closed the application and rested my phone face down on the tray table. For a moment, I stared at my hands, noticing how still they were. I was not angry, not yet. What I felt was disorientation, as though the story I had been telling myself no longer matched the evidence in front of me. I had believed I was choosing generosity. Now I wondered when that choice had begun to feel compulsory. Around me, the cabin filled with small movements. A man adjusted his seat. Someone else reached for a magazine. Life went on in its ordinary way, indifferent to the shift taking place inside me. I thought about Melissa and her family settling into their larger seats, accepted into a space where comfort was assumed. I imagined the ease of that separation, How natural it must have felt to her. I reminded myself that this was not the moment to draw conclusions. I was tired. Emotions ran high during travel. It would be better, I decided, to look at everything carefully once I was home, in the quiet of my own kitchen. That thought offered a small measure of control. I did not need to solve anything now. I only needed to acknowledge that something required attention. As the plane lifted into the air, I felt a strange combination of resolve and reluctance. Part of me wanted to set the phone aside and forget what I had seen. Another part, quieter but steadier, insisted that ignoring it would only deepen the problem. I realized then that my discomfort was not about money alone. It was about agency. Somewhere along the way, I'd allowed my desire to help to replace my right to ask questions. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, letting the vibration of the aircraft settle around me. I told myself that after this trip, I would take a closer look, not with suspicion, but with honesty. It was a small decision, tentative and private, but it marked a shift. For the first time, I was considering what it might mean to place my own sense of security alongside my role as a mother, rather than beneath it. If you can already see the pattern forming and feel the weight of those numbers, comment number 4 below to show you are still here. Now the real confrontation begins. Chapter 5. The conflict erupts. When I returned to Eugene, the house greeted me with the same quiet steadiness it always had. Nothing had changed, and yet I felt as though I had crossed an invisible line. The trip to Napa Valley ended without incident on the surface, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. Once my suitcase was unpacked and the door closed behind me, there was no distraction left to soften the thoughts I had been postponing. I sat at the kitchen table that first evening and opened my laptop, determined to look at my finances with a clarity I had avoided before. This time, I did not skim. I worked carefully, month by month, transfer by transfer, writing figures down by hand the way I used to when numbers mattered more than convenience. As the totals grew, my stomach tightened. The amount was not simply higher than I remembered, it was overwhelming. What I had framed as occasional help had become a steady stream of money flowing in one direction, unchecked and unquestioned. The realization carried a particular kind of weight. It was not just about loss. It was about consent. I had never said no, but I had also never agreed to this. Somewhere along the way, my willingness had been quietly redefined into obligation. Seeing it laid out in black and white stripped away the last of my excuses. I waited a day before calling Melissa. I wanted to be calm, factual, impossible to dismiss. When she answered, I spoke carefully, explaining that I had been reviewing my accounts and needed clarity. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked when we planned to reconcile the amounts that had accumulated. Her response came quickly and defensively. She insisted I was mistaken, that I was misremembering conversations we had already resolved. She reminded me of how stressful her life was, how much pressure Andrew was under, how grateful she had always been. As she spoke, she began to question my memory in small, precise ways. She asked whether I was tired, whether I might be confusing dates, whether this stress was too much for me at my age. That was the moment something inside me hardened. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. This was no longer confusion. It was strategy. When Andrew joined the call, his tone was measured and detached, as though we were discussing a business discrepancy rather than a mother's concern. He spoke about oversight, about simplifying things for my benefit, about the importance of not letting emotions cloud judgment. Then came the suggestion, offered lightly but unmistakably, that perhaps I was no longer in the best position to manage complex financial matters on my own. He framed it as concern, as protection. The implication was clear enough to leave no doubt. If I continued asking questions, they would question my capacity instead. I ended the call shortly after, my hands trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. I sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, staring at the familiar grain of the wood. The house felt different now, not unsafe but exposed. The truth had settled fully into place, heavy and unavoidable. This was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with reassurance. It was a confrontation with a version of my daughter I did not recognize, and a recognition of my own vulnerability. What hurt most was not the money. It was the ease with which concern had been weaponized against me. I had always believed that love created safety. That night, I understood that love without boundaries created opportunity, and not always for good intentions. I knew then that whatever came next would not be simple. The illusion of family harmony had shattered, and there was no way to gather the pieces without cutting myself in the process. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one question echoed with uncomfortable clarity. Would I retreat into familiar silence, or would I protect myself, even if it meant standing alone? I did not sleep the night after that call. The house was quiet in the way only a house can be when it has witnessed decades of life and now holds only one. I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the wind brushing lightly against the maple tree outside my window. My mind replayed Melissa's tone, Andrew's measured suggestions, the casual way they had introduced the idea that I might not be capable of managing my own affairs. The words had been framed as concern, but they carried something colder underneath. By morning, I understood that I was standing at a threshold. One path was painfully familiar. I could call Melissa back, soften my questions, apologize for misunderstanding. I could reopen whatever access they had quietly grown accustomed to and restore the fragile balance that had defined our relationship. It would mean swallowing doubt and pretending that my review of those numbers had been unnecessary. It would also mean peace, at least on the surface. The other path was uncertain and isolating. It required me to trust my own judgment over my daughter's reassurance. It required me to accept that asking for accountability might cost me closeness. I would risk being labeled difficult, suspicious, even unstable. For a woman who had spent her life maintaining harmony, that prospect felt almost unnatural. I sat at my kitchen table again, this time not to review numbers, but to examine myself. What was I truly afraid of? Losing Melissa's affection? Being kept at a distance from my grandchildren? Or admitting that I had allowed generosity to blur into vulnerability? The more I asked, the clearer the answer became. What frightened me most was not their disapproval. It was the possibility of surrendering control over my own life. That realization steadied me. I reached for my phone and searched for a financial attorney in Eugene, someone unaffiliated with anyone my daughter might know. Making the appointment felt both dramatic and deeply practical. I did not inform Melissa. I did not announce my intentions. For once, I acted without seeking permission. During the consultation, I presented the documentation I had compiled. The attorney reviewed the statements carefully, asking precise questions. There was no alarm in her voice, but there was gravity. She pointed out the pattern of transfers, the lack of formal agreements, the vulnerability inherent in informal arrangements. When I mentioned the suggestion that I might be incapable of managing my finances, she advised something I had not yet considered. Obtain an independent cognitive evaluation. Not because I doubted myself, but because evidence could silence insinuation. That advice struck me as both humiliating and empowering. I scheduled the evaluation within the week. Sitting in the clinic, answering questions about memory and reasoning, I felt a strange mix of indignation and resolve. I did not need validation to know who I was, yet I understood that documentation could serve as armor. The attorney also highlighted several transactions that warranted closer scrutiny. Some funds appeared to have been used in real estate ventures connected to Andrew's business. She did not accuse him of wrongdoing outright, but she noted the risk involved. My money had not simply bridged expenses, it had underwritten ambition. Driving home from that meeting, I felt a shift that was neither anger nor relief. It was clarity. I could no longer pretend that maintaining peace justified self-neglect. If Melissa and Andrew chose to interpret boundaries as hostility, that interpretation would belong to them. That evening, I logged into my accounts and confirmed the changes I had already initiated. Access remained restricted. I did not draft an explanation. I did not send a warning. I understood that consequences would follow. They would likely respond with escalation rather than reflection. But for the first time since that moment at the airport, I felt aligned with myself. I was still a mother. That had not changed. What had changed was my willingness to sacrifice dignity in the name of closeness. As the sun set beyond the trees, casting long shadows across my living room floor, I accepted that whatever came next would test me. Yet I also knew that I had crossed a point from which I would not retreat. If you believe that standing your ground always comes with consequences, comment number 6 below, and let's move into chapter 7, where the fallout becomes very real. The notification arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with a formality that made my hands tremble before I even opened it. I already knew what it would contain. Silence from Melissa had stretched for days after I restricted account access. The stillness had not felt like peace. It had felt like strategy. The document inside confirmed what I had anticipated. A petition for medical guardianship had been filed, citing concerns about my cognitive stability and financial decision-making. The language was clinical, detached, almost polite. It described me as vulnerable, confused, in need of oversight. Seeing my own life reduced to those phrases created a sensation I struggled to name. It was not simply anger, it was the realization that my daughter had stepped beyond argument and into accusation. For a few minutes, I sat at the kitchen table and let the weight settle. I thought about the years I had spent protecting her from disappointment, smoothing over mistakes, cushioning consequences. Now I was the one positioned as incapable. The irony was almost unbearable, yet beneath the hurt, there was something steadier, confirmation. My decision in chapter 6 had not been paranoia. It had been necessary. I contacted my attorney immediately. Because I had already obtained a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, we were prepared. The documentation showed clear memory function, reasoning ability, and independent judgment. Financial records were organized and transparent. I had acted methodically, not erratically. The preparation that once felt excessive now felt like armor. The hearing took place in a small civil courtroom that felt colder than the weather outside. Melissa sat across from me, composed but distant. Andrew remained beside her, posture rigid, eyes forward. I studied my daughter's face, searching for hesitation, for doubt. I saw resolve instead. Whatever version of me she was presenting to the court, she had convinced herself of it. Their attorney spoke of concern and protection. He framed the petition as an act of love, an attempt to safeguard a mother who had recently demonstrated poor judgment. The argument was careful and rehearsed, but it relied on implication rather than evidence. When my attorney presented the independent medical report and the financial documentation, the contrast became clear. There was no confusion in my records. There was no decline in my evaluation. There was only a boundary that had disrupted expectation. The judge's decision was delivered without theatrics. The petition for guardianship was denied. The court affirmed my right to manage my own affairs and noted the absence of credible proof of incapacity. The words were measured, but their meaning was unmistakable. I was competent. I was autonomous. I was not the fragile figure described in the filing. When it was over, I did not approach Melissa. She did not approach me. We left through separate doors, our steps echoing in opposite directions down the hallway. There was no reconciliation waiting outside, no apology offered in the parking lot, only distance. Driving home, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt a quiet emptiness. The court had protected my legal standing, but something less tangible had shifted permanently. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. My daughter had chosen to challenge my autonomy in a public forum. Even though I had prevailed, the fracture remained. That evening, as I set the court papers neatly into a folder, I understood that consequences rarely end with a verdict. The denial of the petition was not the conclusion of the conflict. It was simply the confirmation that I would not surrender myself to preserve an illusion. Whatever followed would unfold from that truth. After the hearing, life did not return to normal. It rearranged itself. The quiet of Eugene felt different now, not fragile, but earned. I moved through my days with a steadiness that surprised me. There was no celebration in the court's decision, only clarity. The boundary had held. What followed unfolded without my interference. Within weeks, I learned through my attorney that Andrew's professional circle had begun asking questions. Financial oversight committees do not ignore public guardianship disputes, especially when they intersect with large property transactions. Records that once sat quietly in files were being reviewed. Contracts were examined more closely. I did not contact anyone. I did not encourage scrutiny. The process moved forward on its own momentum. The strain began to show in Melissa's life as well. Andrew was placed under internal review, and certain transactions were flagged for further explanation. Income that had once felt reliable became uncertain. Their lifestyle, built on image and projection, required adjustment. I heard through indirect channels that they were considering selling their home. For the first time, consequence entered their vocabulary in a tangible way. Despite everything, I did not feel satisfaction. I felt umari. I had not sought to dismantle their stability. I had sought to protect my own. The distinction mattered to me. I refused to become vindictive. Instead, I asked my attorney to draft documents establishing educational trusts for my grandchildren. The funds would be managed independently and released only for tuition and approved expenses. The structure ensured that whatever conflict existed between adults would not jeopardize the children's future. When Melissa received the proposal, her response was swift and defensive. She rejected the arrangement unless full financial access was restored. Even in that moment, conditions were attached to reconciliation. I read the message once and did not reply. Silence, this time, was deliberate rather than fearful. As months passed, practical consequences accumulated. Andrew stepped down from his position. The family downsized to a more modest residence. The adjustments were visible, though rarely discussed publicly. Melissa began working outside the home, something she had not done in years. I understood the shift not as punishment, but as exposure. When the external scaffolding of image weakened, reality surfaced. Meanwhile, my own life expanded quietly. I joined a local book club and began volunteering more hours at the library. I enrolled in a watercolor class, discovering that learning something new at 71 felt rebellious in the best way. I traveled alone for the first time since my husband's death, visiting places I had postponed for decades. Independence, once overshadowed by obligation, felt natural again. The conflict had not restored my family, but it had restored me. I no longer measured closeness by financial generosity. I measured it by respect, and as I moved forward, I understood that resolution did not require reunion. It required integrity. If you are wondering whether justice truly brings peace, comment number 8 below and stay with me as we move into the final outcome of this story. By the time autumn returned to Eugene, the sharp edges of the conflict had softened into something steadier. Life had not repaired itself in the way I once imagined it might, but it had settled into a new shape. I no longer waited for my phone to ring. I no longer measured my value by how urgently I was needed. The quiet in my home felt chosen rather than imposed. Andrew's professional situation eventually reached its conclusion. After months of review and mounting scrutiny, he lost his license to operate at the level he once had. The announcement was brief and procedural, stripped of drama. Melissa's family sold their house soon after and moved into a smaller rental property. The adjustment was visible to anyone who paid attention. The carefully curated image they had once maintained no longer fit their circumstances. I did not celebrate their losses. I simply acknowledged them as outcomes of decisions made long before I drew my line. Melissa found employment outside the home for the first time in many years. I heard about it through a mutual acquaintance, not from her directly. That detail mattered. Our communication remained sparse and restrained, polite when necessary, but never intimate. We had not reconciled. We had stabilized at a distance. The educational trusts for my grandchildren were finalized quietly. Funds were allocated under strict management, released only for tuition and approved expenses. The structure removed ambiguity. My love for them would not pass through negotiation. It would be safeguarded independently of adult conflict. I took comfort in that clarity. One afternoon in early November, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Emma stood there, taller than I remembered, holding a backpack against her shoulder. She had taken the bus from her new neighborhood. Her visit was not orchestrated. It was chosen. We sat at the kitchen table for hours, not discussing courtrooms or money, but school projects, books she loved, and stories about her grandfather she had never heard. She asked quiet questions about the past. I answered honestly but without bitterness. I did not frame her parents as villains. I framed them as people who made complicated choices. When she left, I drove her home myself, aware that trust rebuilds through small, consistent acts rather than declarations. As I pulled back into my driveway that evening, I recognized something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer waiting for my daughter to validate me as a mother. I was living as a whole person with or without her approval. The fracture in our relationship remained, but it no longer defined me. Family, I had learned, is not a guarantee of harmony. It is a space where respect must be mutual to survive. I could not control Melissa's path, but I could protect my own. And in doing so, I had preserved something essential: the ability to look at myself without regret. When I think back to the woman standing in that airport terminal, quietly accepting a seat apart from her own family, I recognize her, but I no longer live inside her skin. She believed that love meant accommodation at any cost. She believed that generosity guaranteed loyalty. She believed that keeping the peace was the same as preserving connection. I understand why she thought those things. I lived by them for most of my life. What I did not understand then was the difference between love and surrender. I had confused the two so thoroughly that I could not see when one had replaced the other. Giving felt noble. Saying yes felt maternal. Asking questions felt disloyal. It took humiliation, legal papers, and the quiet echo of a courtroom to force me to examine that belief. I do not pretend that the loss did not hurt. There are evenings when I still feel the absence of what my relationship with Melissa once was, or what I hoped it would be. There are moments when I wish the fracture had never occurred, but I no longer wish I had stayed silent. Silence would have preserved an illusion, not a bond. Family is not a contract that guarantees respect. It is a relationship that requires it. I had spent years assuming that biology alone secured my place. I know now that respect must be mutual to endure. Without it, love becomes leverage, and generosity becomes expectation. Setting boundaries did not make me cruel. It made me clear. Protecting my finances was not about the money alone. It was about protecting my autonomy, my judgment, and my right to be regarded as a capable adult. Age does not erase that right. Motherhood does not cancel it. Today, my home in Eugene feels grounded in a way it never did before. The quiet is no longer a reminder of distance. It is a reminder of choice. I choose how I spend my time. I choose how I share my resources. I choose who has access to my life. That clarity has brought a kind of peace I did not know I was missing. I remain a mother. That identity has not dissolved. What has changed is my understanding of it. Love without boundaries is not devotion. It is vulnerability without protection. And while I cannot rewrite the past, I can live the rest of my life with open eyes. The woman at the airport stepped aside to avoid discomfort. The woman I am now stands still and holds her ground. That difference is the only victory that truly matters. Some stories are not about revenge or victory. They are about awakening. They remind us that love without self-respect slowly erodes the very foundation it hopes to protect. Boundaries are not walls built to shut others out. They are lines drawn to preserve dignity. When we confuse sacrifice with devotion, we risk losing ourselves in the process. But when we choose clarity over comfort and courage over silence, we rediscover something far more valuable than approval. We rediscover our own voice. Growing older does not mean growing smaller. It means understanding what truly deserves our energy and what quietly drains it. Peace is not found in keeping everyone pleased. It is found in standing steady within our own truth. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you value stories about strength, dignity, and second beginnings, consider subscribing and following along.